You could be forgiven for thinking that Windows Azure Active Directory is the same as Windows Server Active Directory, only running in the cloud. The way to think of Active Directory from now on is as a continuum, from Windows Server Active Directory on the left-hand side through to Windows Azure Active Directory on the right-hand side, with each contributing their own set of relevant services. For example, Windows Server Active Directory offers 5 core services: Active Directory Domain Services, Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services, Active Directory Federation Services, Active Directory Certificate Services, and Active Directory Rights Management Services. Over on the right-hand side, today, there are just a couple of services: Windows Azure Active Directory, which offers services around the identity problem, and Windows Azure Access Control Service, which federates identities from external providers, like Google, Yahoo, Facebook, even your on-premises AD. But in the future, more services will be added. Windows Server Active Directory was designed to work on the corporate network, where the enterprise has full control over topology, and it exposes services for the management of identity, servers, workstations, security, network policy, and so on. And these are exposed through enterprise protocols like Kerberos, LDAP, DNS, AD replication, and so on. Today, Windows Azure Active Directory limits itself to one area: identity, and it exposes its services through protocols that work well in the world of Internet-connected cloud applications, such as a REST API and various Internet identity protocols. For this reason, you can't take an AD integrated application from the enterprise and install it in the cloud so you can connect it up to Windows Azure Active Directory. You have to build apps with the Windows Azure version of Active Directory in mind right from the outset. Many of you will have been using Windows Azure Active Directory for a couple of years already. That's because it's exactly the same directory service that's used to manage Office 365 for services such as Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, and Lync Online. Windows Azure AD was designed a few years ago from the ground up to support both Office 365 applications, Windows Azure Cloud applications, and Internet-connected applications. It's just that these features have only been released since July 2012 as a preview for developers. If you already have Office 365, you already have a Windows Azure Active Directory tenant. If not, you can get a free Windows Azure AD tenant at http://aka.ms/WAAD signup. So where does Windows Azure Active Directory, or WAAD, fit into the picture? Well, just as the enterprise starts to get a grip on the proliferation of digital identities and starts to solve the problems of too many usernames and passwords, cloud computing has started to refragment that story again. It's because the technologies and protocols that are used inside the corporate network to provide single sign-on and digital identity coherency are not very good at spanning the internet. The result is that often an application that gets moved to the cloud can no longer take advantage of internal identity systems, and the user is presented with a YAUP, a YAUP, or yet another username and password to remember. Traditional directories, like X500 or LDAP, expose a universe of hierarchies and relationships between the objects they contain. For example, certain users might be members of a group or a role. A user may have a manager, who has a manager, who has a manager, and so on. This so-called graph of the directory's content can be queried and returned to applications that require that kind of information. For example, to find a skip manager to approve your expenses when your immediate manager is on holiday. Windows Azure Active Directory is no different. It exposes the graph of relationships in this way with a REST API called the Directory Graph API. Azure Active Directory is a directory service that lives in the Windows Azure cloud. It's a highly scalable, distributed service that runs across many servers in Microsoft data centers around the world. The service exposes interfaces, such as the Directory Graph API we just mentioned, and authentication endpoints for OAuth 2, the SAML protocol, WS Federation, and more in the future. Now that's the service, but the service contains the data which is owned by each customer who has a tenant. There are lots of tenants inside the service. The tenants have names like mydirectory.onmicrosoft.com, but they can be configured to names like mydirectory.com. Each customer, though, looks after the data in their particular tenant. There's a portal to manage users, groups, domains, services, and so on. For the customer to configure an application, they create a service principal in their tenant. This is just an object that describes a service, their application. A couple of important things it contains are an identifier, known as an app principal ID, and a secret. The app is set up with a link to the service principal. It might also have a database that contains profile information such as the user's expense history. No usernames or password is stored here though, only application data. The Azure AD, in this case mydir.onmicrosoft.com, holds the user's ID and password. It exposes the authentication and graph API endpoints. When a user wants to use the application, they connect to the URL. The app redirects their browser to the authentication endpoint. That's when the Azure AD login page pops up. They enter their credentials, and then a security token is created by Azure AD, which contains, among other things, their name identifier, 123 in this case. The token is digitally signed, so there can be no doubt it was issued by this directory tenant and couldn't have been spoofed. The token is returned to the app, which validates the signature. In this case, the app then consults the profile database to find a match of the ID in the token, 123. When it finds it, it can retrieve the profile information for that user. At no time did the app see or need knowledge of the user's password. It's not practical for the entire content of the directory tenant to be returned in the token. This is where the application can use the Graph API. It can either access the directory using the secret, or, depending on the protocol, it can use delegated access, where it accesses the directory in the security context of the user. Say the app needs information about the user's manager. The details of the user's manager can then be returned, and this data could be used to, for example, complete an expense report. This scheme will work for applications deployed to the Windows Azure Cloud, to other cloud operators' environments, to your own on-premises applications, and for your Office 365 subscriptions, giving you web single sign-on across all of these platforms. But what if you have a substantial intranet infrastructure with file servers, print servers, IIS web servers, SQL servers, SharePoint servers, numerous AD integrated line of business and enterprise apps? Well, in that case, by deploying ADFS, Active Directory Federation Services, to your on-premises environment, you can use federation between your local AD and Windows Azure AD. That would give you Windows single sign-on to all of it. To keep the security principles in the two directories linked, there is a synchronization tool, DirSync, the same tool that's used to sync Office 365 to AD, to keep the two environments in sync with each other. When you use it in concert with federation, it means passwords are managed and checked by your on-premises AD. This is great because it means when a user leaves your organization, by simply disabling or deleting their on-premise AD account, they are automatically locked out of everything. This is a much superior solution to having apps each with their own username and password. A user might get time to use an internet-connected application before their account in it is deprovisioned and do untold business damage to the organization. If you're a developer using Visual Studio 2012, you can implement the protocols yourself, but by far the easiest way is to use the libraries supplied by Microsoft. You'll want to install the Windows Identity Foundation 4.5 SDK, the WIF F4.5 SDK, and then the ASP.NET Fall update for Visual Studio. This massively simplifies the process of making an application Azure AD aware. The context menu shows a new option, Enable Windows Azure Authentication. You're just prompted for the administrator credentials of your Windows Azure AD tenant, and from that point on, the creation of the service principal and the configuration of WIF in your application is done for you. You can even use the Publish item in the context menu to push your web app to a Windows Azure website, and the tool will update the configuration to work in the cloud for you.
We'll take a look at the process now for creating a new custom Active Directory domain in my Azure subscription. So to do this in the marketplace, I'm going to click New and just simply type Active Directory. And this will bring me to the Active Directory entry that's in the marketplace. Click on it and you'll notice that it shows you a screenshot of the Classic portal. Well, that's because most functions for Azure Active Directory are still accomplished in the Classic portal. We'll click Create. It'll redirect us to the Classic portal and let us go through the process for creating a new custom Active Directory domain. Now, my particular domain is going to be an Active Directory domain that I'm going to use to store users for an application that we're building. And so I'm just going to call this one my app directory. And I'm going to call this one CJH app1 dir, just to make sure I've got a globally unique .onmicrosoft.com name. Country or region for the directory is going to be United States. And I'll click Create. And then it takes about, just 10 or 15 seconds to create the Active Directory. And once it's done, we'll be able to click on it. And you'll see that we can now do all the common Active Directory functions, such as create users, create groups, or even integrate with an existing on-premises Windows Active Directory. Okay, let's go ahead and look at the process for adding multiple users and groups to an existing Azure Active Directory. So to do this, again, I do this through the Classic portal, manage.windowsazure.com. And again, just the functionality simply hasn't been migrated to the new portal yet. That'll be done at some stage in the future. So once we log on to our Classic portal, I'm going to go ahead and scroll down to my Azure Active Directory area, which is right here. Click on it, and we can see my app directory that I previously created. We'll click on that, and now we can begin the process of adding users and groups. So to add a new user, I simply click Add User. On the bottom, click Add User, and begin to create new user accounts. We can do a new user in my organization with a Microsoft account in another directory, or users in partner companies if I'm federated. So we're going to make Bob. It's just real simple. And you'll notice we can assign him a role. Now, different role types have different levels of permission. For example, we're just going to make him a regular user, but I could make him, for example, a billing admin, which allows him to change billing information, or a password admin, which allows him to reset user passwords. Good role for someone, for example, on a help desk. And then go ahead and click Create. Now it's going to create a random password that I would then need to somehow communicate back to Bob. You can't force a specific password or assign a specific password using this portal. So I'll copy that, send it in an email or a secure instant message or something of that nature. Now we're going to make a group and add Bob to the group. So we'll go to Groups, click Add a Group, and this will be App Users. So this is a group of users that's allowed to log on to my application, for example. Now my application has to understand how to, look up Bob and see what groups he's in and make sure he's in the appropriate group, but that's up to the application developers to build that functionality. They don't have to worry about the functionality of users and groups and all those different administrative pieces. They're just relying on Azure Active Directory for that. They're simply using the end product, which is which users are in which groups. Click on OK, and now we can go into that group and we can add a member to that group. And notice it says the group is still being configured. It might take a couple of minutes. We're going to go ahead and try anyway. Usually this happens pretty quick. So we'll click on Bob, hit the check mark, and if everything is well, there we go. So it allows us to add Bob to that group. So now we can see Bob's actually a member of that group. Now if Bob were, for example, an administrator, we could make him an owner of the group, which would allow him to then add other users to this group. So there you have it. Some pretty simple process for adding users and groups within Windows Azure. Keep in mind, you can do all this in PowerShell as well, as we showed you some of the commandlets. You just have to make sure you download the appropriate Azure Active Directory PowerShell module, and then all these functions are available through PowerShell.
And this video is going to be on Azure Active Directory Connect, or Azure AD Connect. You may have heard of Azure AD Connect. It's the new version of DirSync or Azure AD Sync. If you've used those in the past, this is going to replace those and all the other identity integration tools like that. So Azure AD Connect is a way to set up your Active Directory Azure to sync the password to your Azure in the cloud. So it syncs on-prem and cloud Azure Active Directory. And what's the goal of this? We want to be able to provide single sign-on for SaaS applications, and that's what Azure AD lets you do. So if you want to have single sign-on on-prem and in many, many different SaaS applications online, you're going to want to implement Azure AD Connect. So in this video, Jim is going to show you what it looks like to download the tool, to install and configure Azure AD Connect. It's only 10 minutes, pretty quick, a lot of value. So I hope you enjoy this video. We'll see you next time on OEM TV.
Hello there. In this demonstration, I'm going to show you how to set up Azure AD Connect and synchronize your on-premise Active Directory to your Azure Active Directory. So as most of you already know, as soon as you set up a SaaS application that uses Azure Active Directory like Office 365, you can then use single sign-on to sign on to that application and synchronize it with your on-premise Active Directory infrastructure. So most companies, large and small, have some Active Directory infrastructure on-premise. And the further we move towards the cloud and cloud applications, the more we want to integrate these directory services. So Azure Active Directory is much different than on-premise Active Directory in the sense that you don't really have all the infrastructure that you have with on-premise Active Directory. For example, with on-premise Active Directory, you deploy your own domain controllers. You set up your own sites. You set up your own trust domains. All that configuration, the creation of the users and the administrators, and so all this is done through either Active Directory Administration Center or Active Directory Users and Computers. The whole idea with Azure Active Directory is that it provides you single sign-on to SaaS applications. That's its goal. So I am actually on a domain controller right now, and I'm set up with an on-premise DC for contoso.com. So what I've done is I have added in Contoso AAD as an Active Directory domain in Azure, and I'm going to go ahead and synchronize my on-premise user accounts to this domain. The whole idea behind this is so that when somebody changes a password on-prem, it's going to persist that password change out to Azure Active Directory. And it's not truly single sign-on because there's going to be some delay and some latency between when the password is changed on-prem and when it's actually replicated out to Azure. And it's a short period of time, but it's near real-time replication. So the goal is single sign-on, and the whole focus of this is to provide you a platform that you can authenticate and authorize users to use SaaS applications. Okay, so to get started with this, you first of all want to turn on directory integration for your domain. So I am in Contoso AAD, and I created an admin user in Contoso AAD. The name of the user is admin@contosoaad123. That's the actual domain name. contosoaad123.onmicrosoft.com. So what I'm going to do is go to the directory integration properties page, and you can see it's deactivated right now. I'm going to go ahead and activate directory integration and then save it. This is your first step. Are you sure you want to activate directory sync? I'm going to say yes. So this will take a second, and then this will show up as an activated domain. I'll just refresh. So it's enabling the domain to be synchronized through an on-prem Active Directory. Okay, so now it's activated. So the first step is to install and configure Azure Active Directory or Azure Active Directory Connect. So I'm going to go back to the root level, click on my domain, and I'm going to go ahead and download Azure AD Connect. Now Azure AD Connect is a tool where you can synchronize your on-premise environment from a domain controller on-prem to your Azure Active Directory account list. So I'm going to go ahead and download this. We'll save this, 74 megabytes. We'll just drop it right in the downloads folder. We'll click save. And there's Azure AD Connect. So I'm going to go ahead and launch it. Now the first thing that's going to happen is it's going to walk me through the setup, and then it's going to prompt me to configure synchronization. So go ahead and agree to the license, and we'll click continue. Okay, so you can either do an express, you can customize. I'll show you the more in-depth setup. I'm going to click customize. Okay, specify a custom installation location. I don't need to do that. Use an existing SQL Server. If you don't have a SQL Server, this requires SQL Server, by the way. If you don't have a SQL Server, then it's going to download it and install SQL Server Express for you. Use an existing service account. I don't need to do that. I'm just going to use the system account. And specify custom sync groups. If I wanted to specify custom sync groups, then I can basically pick organizational units or Windows groups that I just want to synchronize. I may not want to synchronize my entire domain. So I'm going to go ahead and click install, and this is going to start the installation process. Okay, now you're going to be presented with two options for synchronization. The first one is password synchronization, which is the simplest form. For small, medium-sized businesses, this is going to be the easiest to set up and the easiest to maintain. Or you can do a federation with ADFS. And ADFS is Active Directory Federation Services. More complex setup, but allows you more capabilities. So we're just going to go with password sync between Azure AD and on-prem. Okay, now it's asking me what credentials to use to connect to Azure AD. I'll go ahead and use my admin account, which is admin@contosoad123.onmicrosoft.com, and I'll type in the password. Click next. Now this should log on, bring up a list of domains. Okay, so now it says connect to your directories. Okay, so the directory is Active Directory. My domain is contoso.com, and it wants to know what my local administrator permissions are. This account needs to be a domain admin. So this will be contoso/administrator and the password. So this is my on-prem account information. All right, so I'm done. I've already got one directory in there. I can add multiple directories if I've got a forest that I want to synchronize. I'm just going to leave the single directory there and click next. So now it's retrieving my directory schema. Okay, it sees contoso.com and select the on-premise attribute used to synchronize AD names. You always use the user principal name or the UPN. Now I don't really need to verify much here. I just want to basically say continue, and what it will do is do a enumeration of the Active Directory structure, and it'll bring me all of my domain accounts, and I'll have the option to filter later if I want to. Okay, sync all domains and OUs. Otherwise, this is where I can sync domains and OUs. I can limit them to, specifics. So if I say I want to only sync certain things, then you can sync just specific OUs if you want to. I'm just going to sync everything. So we'll click next. Select how users will be identified in your on-premise directory. Users will be presented only once across all directories. And I don't have any custom attributes that I want to set up, but I could use custom attributes, maybe associate with a specific subscription in Azure if I wanted to. But I'm just going to go ahead and use my my usernames that are associated with the global unique identifiers. Okay, synchronize all users and devices. We'll click next. And actually, do go to previous. If you want to, you can do a custom group. Just put the distinguished name of the group here, and that will be a list of all the users that you want to synchronize. Otherwise, it's just going to synchronize all users. Okay, and that's all I'm going to do, just a password synchronization. So we'll click next. And off we go. So it's going to start the synchronization process when configuration completes. Now the configuration takes a little bit of time, but this is the end of the user interface component. So this will run for about 10 minutes. It'll download SQL Server 2008 R2 Express, and then it will install and configure synchronization. So once this is done, we're going to be synchronized across the board with our on-prem side to our directory structure in Azure. So I'll click install. This will go ahead and bring the installation up, get it going, and we'll check back with this when it's done. Okay, so we're back. The installation completed. Go ahead and click exit here. And then in Contoso AD, I'm going to refresh, and we should have some new users. And we do. So you can see all these new users that were just added, and they were sourced from the local Active Directory. And that's it for Azure AD Connect. Pretty straightforward tool, works with Office 365 and Azure. So if you have an Office 365 environment and you want to synchronize, use the Office 365 admin portal. You can also use the new preview admin portal. If it's just Azure that you want to synchronize, then you can do it exactly the way I showed you here from within the Azure portal.
Azure Active Directory Premium, built on top of Azure AD, is a service from Microsoft that helps you protect your business and empower your end users. It helps you move your enterprise to the cloud with whatever speed is right for you. You can decide when is the right time for your organization to begin using each of the features of Azure AD Premium based on your own business priorities. You can use our solutions on-premises, in the cloud, or a combination of both, which we call the hybrid enterprise. Azure AD provides a cloud directory with user management capabilities, integration to your existing Windows Server Active Directory, and single sign-on to over 1,200 cloud applications such as Salesforce.com, Office 365, and Box. Azure AD Premium extends this by including functionality for delegating access management for cloud applications, multi-factor authentication, reporting, and analytics. It also lets you deploy great experiences to empower your end users with features such as delegated group management and self-service password reset. Azure AD meets enterprise requirements with a 99.9% SLA and no limits to the size of your directory. Azure AD Premium takes a user-centric perspective to access management. What users want is to get their work done with as few barriers as possible. Azure AD Premium provides an access panel customized with the logo of your organization where your users can get single sign-on to all of their cloud applications. Users can access this functionality in many different browsers, devices, and platforms, and they can do this with the same familiar identity that they use to access resources in your local network. Groups are one of the most important mechanisms that enterprises use to control access to applications. Azure AD Premium provides delegated group management functionality that lets end users create their own groups and manage membership of those groups. Users can request to join groups owned by other people and approve requests from others to join their groups. You can also use the groups you already have in your local Windows Server AD to assign access to applications in the cloud by synchronizing groups between your local AD and your Azure AD in the cloud. Forgotten user passwords are one of the main sources of headaches and costs for both users and IT staff. With Azure AD Premium, a user who forgets their password can reset it themselves to access resources in the cloud and on your local network using a process that you can easily configure to meet your organization's security requirements. Azure AD Premium provides rich functionality to help you identify and take action on user accounts that may be compromised. We also alert you to user sign-ins that may be irregular or suspicious, based on machine learning-based algorithms trained at scale using previous observations of sign-in activity by the user, their organization, and other data. We make it easy for you to take action on such an account, such as resetting the user's password, adding multi-factor authentication for the account, or blocking user access. We also provide reports to help you understand usage of cloud services by users in your organization. Azure AD Premium Multi-Factor Authentication provides a solution that's easy for you to deploy and operate while remaining simple for your users. You can quickly configure the list of users that need to use multi-factor authentication to access SaaS applications and local resources. A user can register and verify their contact information in just a few seconds, and then they'll get an automated phone call or text message that lets them verify themselves as part of each sign-in process. Your subscription to Azure AD Premium also includes rights to use Forefront Identity Manager. Forefront Identity Manager is Microsoft's solution for managing user identity in an environment that includes Active Directory and other stores of users' identity such as HR systems, other LDAP directories, databases, or custom applications. So, with Azure AD Premium, you have an end-to-end solution to ensure a consistent and authoritative view of user identities across all of the applications used in your environment that run in your private cloud or the public cloud.
In this final module, we'll take a look at multi-factor authentication as it's available within Azure Active Directory. Now, first of all, what is multi-factor authentication? Well, it's the notion that you're not going to log on with just a username and password. You can, for example, have your phone, and you can have Azure text you a message to confirm that this is you by you having access to your phone. There's apps you can put on a phone that will require that you authenticate with the app before you're allowed to proceed. You can also receive phone calls. You can receive text messages. Or there's other third-party options for devices like, PIN devices, the hardware PIN devices that you can have. So there's a number of available options, but the idea here is that it's more than just a password. You've got to demonstrate something you are, something you have, something you know. Any two of those three is what's called two-factor authentication. You know a password and you possess a physical device such as a phone, for example. Now, this is a great security solution for both cloud apps and on-premise applications. And Azure Multi-Factor integrates with both native cloud-only applications and also through some components of Windows Server allows you to extend to include Azure Multi-Factor as part of an on-premises authentication solution. So here's some examples of where this can actually apply. You can use this for Office 365. So to ensure, with Office 365, more and more internal corporate secure data is being stored in places like OneDrive for business and SharePoint Online and so forth. Well, in the past, you had to be on the physical LAN to get access to those resources. So there was another authentication mechanism, which was you had to get in the building. Now, as data moves to the cloud, we want something that's stronger than a password. And so Office 365 provides an ideal scenario for Azure Multi-Factor Authentication. If you tell your Office 365 subscription to use Azure Active Directory as its authentication provider, you can then enable multi-factor in Azure Active Directory and further secure Office 365. For the case of remote desktop services for RDP access both to cloud resources and also to on-premises data centers supports the notion of what's called radius authentication. Radius authentication allows a logon process to ask a third party to validate it further. And so Azure Active Directory supports the notion of radius-based authentication for things like remote desktop services. So when you go to RDP into a system, you first have to validate via Azure Multi-Factor Authentication. It also works with Active Directory Federation services. So if you're building applications that rely on Active Directory Federation services, you can integrate that with Azure Active Directory and enable multi-factor authentication. So what we're going to do now is go in and actually look at how we enable multi-factor authentication for Azure Active Directory. Let's take a look at how easy it is to enable multi-factor authentication for a user in one of our directories. So here I've got the user Bob that we created just a little while ago. We're going to enable multi-factor authentication for Bob so he can use his phone or a mobile app to verify that he is in fact, who he claims to be before he accesses an application. As the administrator, if Bob, for example, had, higher privilege or he was accessing secure information, we might want him to have more than just a password. We may want to verify he has, for example, his mobile device that only he has access to as a way of authenticating. So this is really simple to do. We're simply going to check Bob and then enable multi-factor authentication. Where Bob will go to complete the setup is this URL right here, aka.ms/MFA setup. So we'll check enable multi-factor auth and click close. Now what Bob has to do is log on with his password and indicate what his second method of authentication is going to be. So to do that, we're just going to open an in-private browser session so we don't automatically log back on as my administrator. I'm going to go to that aka.ms/MFA setup URL. We're going to log in as Bob. Just going to grab his username here and copy it to make it simpler. And his password. I did reset Bob's password before I did this demo to make it simpler. And we're going to go ahead and click sign in. And so you'll note that it says, hey, your administrator required that you set up an additional security verification. Set it up now. So we'll click on that and it'll now take us through a very straightforward wizard that allows us to verify who Bob actually is. And he has a couple of choices. He can use a mobile app, which would actually require he to log on to a mobile app on his phone. He can use an office phone number, which is configured in his account, or he can use a pre-configured authentication phone number. Sorry, not a pre-configured, but an authentication phone number where he types in his phone number and it will actually text him or call him. And he'll get the text, reply to the text that verifies that he has his phone, or he'll answer the phone call, enter a few key sequences, and that's all that's required to set this up. Once that's complete, every time Bob attempts to authenticate to Azure Active Directory, it's automatically going to require he have that second piece of authentication in the form of a phone app or his phone for either a call, a voice call, or a text message.
If you'd like to know more about Microsoft Azure, go to the Microsoft Azure blog at http://blogs.msdn.com/Windows Azure.